Have you ever had to play peacekeeper in your household?
During the so-called gift ceremony, which my parents framed as a sweet and tidy moment to honor our grandparents' wishes and keep the family close, Dad cleared his throat like he always does when he is about to make something sound official, and he said, with that managerial tone he saves for other people's feelings, that the envelopes on the table would not be opened one by one and shared like we initially discussed, because, after much consideration, he and Mom had decided that those envelopes would be kept for Emily, since she was the one who truly deserved them, and I should be proud to support my sister in this new chapter of her life where a little boost would go further for her than it would for me. And in the second it took for people to process what he had said, I could feel the room leaning toward the script they have always loved, where Emily is the gold star and I am the steady background character who smiles and claps and promises to help with logistics. I did not clap and I did not smile, because I have done that for years, through the college save that turned into Emily's study abroad, through the temporary car that became her permanent car, through the rent that was supposed to be a bridge and became a lifestyle, through the holidays where she arrived empty-handed and left with leftovers packed like a catering order, through the conversations where my careful questions about fairness were brushed aside with jokes about me being too serious, and through the calls where Mom assured me that love is not measured in money while quietly measuring love in money. So I just sat there and listened, and I felt that old tightness in my throat. The same tightness I had at my high school awards night when Dad missed my name because he was on the phone helping Emily negotiate a roommate issue. The same tightness I had when my financial aid advisor asked why the account listed on my paperwork had gone quiet right before tuition was due. The same tightness I had when I told myself not to ruin family peace by asking for receipts. Dad kept talking because that is what he does when he thinks authority is the same as truth, telling the room that Emily had demonstrated needs and I had demonstrated stability. And the way he paired those words made it sound like my compound interest and steady bills were character defects, while Emily's drifting was a tender flower that needed watering, and I suppose to them it has always been romantic to rescue her. As if being rescued is a brand, as if being responsible is a fountain you can drink from whenever you are thirsty and never worry about who pays the water bill. And in that moment I looked at my sister, who would not meet my eyes, and I knew she expected me to take the hit, because I always have. I felt Mark's knee bump mine under the table, not a dramatic cue so much as a reminder that we had talked about this exact posture for months, not because we wanted a showdown, but because pattern recognition is a survival skill. And when you spend enough time being told to be grateful for crumbs while someone else gets the cake, you eventually learn to count the crumbs and you learn where the cake is baked. So I took a breath and I said, as evenly as I could, that I appreciated Dad finally saying the quiet part out loud, that I appreciated knowing where we stood, and that since this was such an important family decision, I wanted him to repeat it clearly so that everyone heard it the same way. Because misunderstandings can ruin families a lot faster than honesty ever will. He bristled at the word repeat like it was an accusation, but I kept my voice steady and I told him I wanted to make sure I had the phrasing right, because words matter, because grandparents do not write equal if they mean everything to one child, because trust does not vanish in a burst of smoke unless there is a match in someone's hand, and because if we were going to do this in public then we should be clear with the public. And when I said that I watched Mom do the thing she always does, where she reaches for the etiquette manual in her head and tries to turn the focus to tone and timing, scolding me for being combative on a special day, as if the only unforgivable sin in our family is refusing to pretend. I could feel the push to step back, to let the moment pass, to be the bigger person, but being the bigger person, in our family, has always meant being the person who gets smaller. So I leaned in, and I said that if Dad truly believed Emily was the only one who deserved those envelopes, he should be able to state it clearly and confidently, and if he could not, then perhaps he already knew there was a problem with what he was doing. And yes, I heard the small gasp from an aunt who loves every fight as long as she can claim she hates conflict, and yes, I saw Emily stiffen like she wanted to convert indignation into innocence on demand. Dad started repeating himself, slower this time, Not because he was rethinking it, but because he wanted it to sound definitive, and as he spoke I found myself thinking about how many times I had covered a shift to help a teammate. How many times I had said no to things I wanted so that my budget made sense. How many times I had caught myself explaining my choices to people who never once explained theirs to me. And I realized I was not going to shrink just to make the room comfortable. Not today, not over this. So when he finished, I thanked him for being clear, and I reached into my bag and took out a simple notepad and a pen, and I said that since this was, in his words, a family decision, I would be writing down what had just been decided so there would be no confusion later, and that I would appreciate it if he and Mom would sign next to the wording, purely to avoid future misunderstandings, which, if you think about it, was the most polite thing I could have asked for. The cousins shifted, the aunts blinked, Mom said that I was turning this into a legal drama, and I said I was turning this into accountability, and Dad said no one was signing anything at a family gathering, and I said that was fine. We could simply note that he refused to sign after asserting the decision, a small fact that would keep our memories honest when this conversation was retold, and I kept my eyes on him because it is amazing what people will say when they think you will not hold them to it. And that is when Mark, who had been quiet up to now because he knows there is a point where silence lands louder than speeches, let out a laugh, not cruel, not mocking, just the kind of laugh you have when the punchline finally lands after years of setup. And he reached into his jacket and pulled out a different stack of letters, slid them onto the table beside the envelopes Dad was guarding like a gatekeeper, and the expressions around us changed so fast you could feel the air rearrange itself as people realized the story they were about to swallow might not be the story they were about to hear. The moment Mark laid that stack of letters down on the table, the room shifted in a way that is hard to describe. Because what had been a staged performance designed to crown Emily as the only child worthy of receiving anything suddenly became something else entirely. A scene where control slipped from my father's hand and hovered in the air like a coin spinning too long before it falls. And the longer that silence lasted, the more people began to realize that maybe, just maybe, this family story had more chapters than the ones Dad and Mom had rehearsed. My father immediately puffed himself up, leaning forward as if authority could be summoned through posture alone, and demanded to know what Mark thought he was doing, because according to him this was a private family matter, but Mark, steady as he always is, simply told him that these were letters written by my grandparents, letters that belonged to me, and if Dad was going to publicly reassign my inheritance, then it was only fair for the family to see what had actually been left behind. I could see my mother's hand twitch toward Emily's wrist as if to keep her calm, though Emily was not calm, she was practically vibrating. Because she has always known in some corner of her mind that the pedestal she is placed on is fragile and could collapse if the truth ever came out, and you could tell she wanted to jump in, to shut this down with indignation, but she stayed quiet for once. Perhaps because even she understood that pretending ignorance would serve her better than speaking too quickly. One of my uncles, who usually avoids weighing in on anything that smells like family drama, leaned forward and asked what the letters were supposed to prove, and that was when Mark opened the first envelope slowly, almost deliberately, and handed it across the table for him to read aloud, and hearing my grandfather's words spill into the room after so many years was almost surreal, because the letter was filled with affection for both of his granddaughters, not just Emily, and more. Importantly, it was explicit in saying that whatever money and gifts they left behind were to be divided equally between us. The room was not silent anymore. It filled with the sounds of shuffling, of people leaning closer, of murmurs that my father could not control, and for once he looked cornered. Though he tried to cover it with his usual line that papers can be taken out of context or that families should not let phrasing ruin the bond of blood, but the truth was sitting there on the table in handwriting everyone recognized, and no one was buying the idea that my grandfather's instructions could be spun into something else. I reminded them all, gently but firmly, that I had not gone looking for these letters with some scheme in mind, that I had stumbled on them months earlier while helping my aunt clean out a storage unit she was finally emptying, and that she had looked me in the eye and told me it was wrong that I had not seen them sooner, because she suspected all along that things were being hidden from me. Dad tried to laugh it off, calling the letters sentimental ramblings, the kind of thing old people write without realizing how it will be interpreted later. But then Mark slid another across the table, and this one was not sentimental at all, because it included a copy of a bank statement that showed money withdrawn from an account that had been in my name years ago, money that never reached me but mysteriously lined up with tuition payments and overseas travel Emily enjoyed. You could feel the edges of the family's loyalty starting to fray, because even the ones who usually stay neutral were visibly disturbed, and my father, for all his bluster, was not ready to explain why his parents' money left my account and surfaced in Emily's expenses. The tension built with each letter we unfolded, because some were just notes about birthdays or holidays that showed equal love, but others were detailed instructions, reminders of fairness, records of what had been given already, and gentle but firm nudges about the importance of treating both daughters with equal dignity. My mother tried her usual trick of guilt, asking me if exposing all of this was worth tearing the family apart, if I really wanted my cousins and aunts and uncles to see us like this. But I answered that I had not written the letters, I had only opened them, and that whatever pain they felt from hearing them could not compare to the years I had spent swallowing the silent pain of being erased from the record of my own family story. The room was growing warmer with accusation and defense, but then Mark tapped the final envelope in the stack, the one he had not yet opened, and said very calmly that before anyone made up their minds about who was telling the truth and who was rewriting it, there was one letter still sealed, one letter that had been left out of the shuffle until now, and that this one, more than any other, would show exactly how much my grandparents had seen, how much they had known, and how deliberate their wishes had been. He placed his hand on it, but did not open it yet, letting the suspense stretch, and in that pause you could almost hear the calculation racing through my father's head, because he knew before anyone else what might be inside. And the fact that he did not reach for it told me everything I needed to know about the secret he had been keeping. The second Mark said there was still a sealed letter, and that it mattered more than any of the pages already on the table. My father tried to grab the conversation back by doing that thing where he speaks slowly and uses the kind of phrases that sound responsible if you do not look too closely, insisting that the letters we had read were sentimental and outdated, and that real decisions had been made later with better information, which was just another way to dismiss anything that did not suit him, while Emily, who is always survived by acting shocked that consequences exist, said she could not believe I would ambush the family on a special day, as if she had not gladly accepted the plan to take every envelope without a single question about whether any of it was fair. I told them I did not ambush anyone, that I let Dad speak first, because I wanted the record to be clear about what he believed he had the right to do, and that if he was confident in that decision, then he should have no problem letting people read what our grandparents actually wrote. So I started handing the letters around the table in a slow circle, not to create theater, but to create accountability. And the more voices that read those lines out loud, the harder it became to pretend the words did not say what they said, because you could hear the equal love, the equal intent, the equal instruction, and you could also see the bank statement copy that tied directly to withdrawals in my name that somehow turned into benefits for my sister. Mom reached for unity like it was a fire extinguisher, telling everyone that families are not businesses and that lawyers ruin everything and that the point of these gatherings is love. And I said that I agreed about love and that I was tired of love being used as a fog machine to hide choices that would not stand up to daylight, and I reminded her that no one would be talking about lawyers if the envelopes had been opened and divided as written, because the only thing I brought to the table today was evidence that matched the promises we were all told existed. My father tried the word forgery, a word he thought would make me back down because it is heavy and scary and implies courts and costs and embarrassment, but I told him calmly that if he wanted to stand on forgery, he was free to do that, and that I would be just as free to take the letters to the same bank manager who watched my grandfather sign papers for decades, to the same notary my grandparents used for everything from car titles to holiday charities, and to the same aunt who kept birthday cards stacked by year with notes on the back in my grandmother's handwriting, because I was not afraid of the truth being tested by people who knew us. An uncle who rarely speaks of these things said he remembered my grandfather saying, Not in a dramatic way, but in the way people talk when they want to set something straight before it becomes messy. That his girls would be treated equally because he did not want money to become a weapon after he was gone. And a cousin who is nobody's fool pointed at a signature and said it was the same looping style on the deed to the lake lot that everyone had seen 100 times, and each small comment chipped away at the idea that this was my temper against their wisdom. It was not, it was facts against habit. Since Dad kept guarding the envelopes like a referee who had already chosen a winner, I told him we were going to do something that respected everyone, which was to remove the envelopes from his custody and put them in neutral hands until we finished reading and verifying the letters, and I turned to Aunt Ruth, the aunt who found the storage unit boxes and who never once asked for anything in exchange for the truth, and I asked if she would hold them, not as a punishment but as a pause button. And even though Dad sputtered about propriety and timing and how this was his house and his table, the room was with me because the room had heard enough to know that control was the issue, not kindness. Aunt Ruth slid the envelopes into her tote with a simple nod that landed harder than any speech, and in that small motion I felt a clean kind of revenge that did not require shouting or insults. Because for the first time in a long time the predictable script did not run. The gatekeeping hand lost its grip, and my place at the table stopped being ceremonial and became real, which was all I ever wanted. And if that stung my father, then maybe the sting came from the truth finally being allowed to sit with us instead of being kept on the porch. Emily said this was humiliating and that I had planned it, and I said I had planned to stop pretending that silence was noble, and I had planned to stop letting other people write my part in the family story. And if the cost of that was a little public discomfort, then maybe that was the first honest currency we had used in years. And while she rolled her eyes and Mom whispered about prayer and patience, Mark placed his hand on the sealed envelope and said, in the same steady tone he uses when he wants no one to miss a word, that this one was different, that this one was not commentary or a birthday note or a list of keepsakes, and that when we opened it, which we would do right here so no one had doubts later, the conversation about who deserved what would be over, and as he lifted the flap just enough for everyone to see the edge of the official stamp without letting a single page slide out, the entire room leaned forward because they felt what I felt, which was that the truth we had been walking around for years was finally about to introduce itself. When Mark finally slid the sealed flap open and eased out the pages with that careful calm he uses when he wants no one to later claim they missed a step, the first thing I saw was the familiar crest from the law office my grandparents always used, and the embossed notary seal pressed so firmly you could feel it through the paper. And before my father could start another speech about context or timing or how families do not need formalities to do the right thing, Mark read a single paragraph. That made the entire room still, because it stated, in plain and deliberate language, that our grandparents were adding an instruction to their will naming me as the executor of anything left unsettled, with the authority to locate, verify, and distribute assets according to their equal intent, and in that instant the script my parents had been directing for years lost its director's chair, because the person they had cast as the background character suddenly had the only job title that mattered. I could almost hear my father searching for a new angle, and he tried one, saying that executors can decline, and that this was obviously a burden I would not want, since I am busy and practical and have no taste for drama. Which was such a predictable attempt to make control sound like responsibility that I almost laughed, but I did not, because I wanted each word to land, and I said that I accepted the role without hesitation, that I would be requesting copies of every document they had used to justify any transfers or decisions they had made since our grandparents passed, and that I would follow the paper wherever it led, which meant that if money meant for me had been redirected to other people, we would settle it properly and openly, and without the usual fog that always seems to blow in whenever fairness is mentioned. Emily said this was absurd and that I was trying to embarrass her, and I told her I was not interested in embarrassment. I was interested in arithmetic, because arithmetic is the only language our family has refused to speak out loud, and that I had no plan to drag her for things she did not sign, but I did plan to insist that benefits she received be accounted for. Not to punish her but to finally assign names to choices, which, if we had done from the start, would have saved everyone from this very moment, and if she wanted to be respected as the adult she always claims to be, then she could start by acknowledging that adults do not accept gifts they know are meant for someone else, and then play surprised when the bill shows up. Mom went straight for love and unity and birthdays and holidays and all the soft things you bring out when hard facts are on the table, asking if I really wanted to drag our grandparents' memory into a fight, and I said I wanted to do the opposite. That I wanted to honor their memory by doing exactly what they asked and exactly what they wrote, and that pretending vagueness where they were explicit was the real disrespect, and I reminded her that this addendum existed because our grandparents saw something they did not like and decided to fix it while they still could, which says more about the pattern than anything I could ever say. Mark, who never enjoys being the loudest voice but understands the value of clarity, placed a small folder beside the addendum and said that we had already met with the bank manager to confirm the signatures and the notary record, that copies of the letters and the addendum were logged, and that a temporary hold could be placed on any accounts tied to the estate if there was evidence of confusion or dispute, which, given the performance we had all just witnessed, seemed like the politest word available, and the silence that followed told me the message had landed exactly where it needed to land. An aunt who has never taken my side before asked, in a level tone that cut cleaner than anger, whether my father had ever informed me that money originally earmarked for my education had been moved, because she remembered a very different plan being spoken of at a family dinner years ago, and when Dad dodged and spun and said circumstances change and families adjust, Mark opened the folder and slid out a timeline with withdrawals that matched dates we could all place, including the semester when my aid package suddenly fell short while Emily's program abroad sailed through without a hitch. And even the cousins who usually keep their heads down looked at one another with that expression people have when they realize the thing they suspected might actually be the thing in front of them. I did not raise my voice or wave the pages or try to humiliate anyone, because I am not interested in revenge that looks like a tantrum. I am interested in a course correction that sticks. So I said that, as executor, I would be taking custody of the envelopes, that Aunt Ruth would hold them in trust with me until the inventory was complete, that a full accounting would be shared with the family, and that any imbalance would be corrected from remaining assets before a single envelope was opened. And then I turned to my father and told him, as plainly as I could say it, that he might want to start thinking about how he planned to explain what happened to the account in my grandmother's name that shows a transfer into a fund he managed during the year after her funeral, because we already know it exists. We already know where the money went, and the only thing left to decide is whether he is going to tell the truth himself or whether I am going to read it to everyone else. The second I mentioned the account in my grandmother's name, the one that should have been closed out cleanly, but instead showed movement long after she was gone, the kind of movement that lined up too perfectly with things we had all watched happen in real time. Like Emily's new car and her extended stay abroad, my father's face drained in a way I had not seen before, not the usual irritation that someone dared to challenge him, but the look of a man who had spent too many years believing he would never be asked the question out loud, and now that it was here, with a stack of papers staring back at him, there was nothing left in his arsenal except the silence that makes people look guiltier than any confession ever could. I stayed calm, not because I was detached, but because I wanted no one to mistake this for anger that could be dismissed as emotion, so I reminded him, in front of everyone, that the documents were already verified, that the trail was already logged, and that the law was not something he could bluff away like a family dinner argument, because once you cross from favoritism into financial manipulation, words like inheritance and executor stop being symbolic and start being binding. Emily panicked first, because she has always been quicker to defend than to think, and she tried to turn the spotlight back on me, saying that I was twisting everything to look like theft when it was really generosity, that our parents had simply supported her more because she needed it, and that money moved around because life is complicated, but her voice shook in a way that made even the cousins who usually by her innocence lean back and cross their arms, because everyone could tell that what she called generosity had been theft by convenience, theft with the safety net of parents who assumed no one would ever call it by its name. My mother began crying, not the kind of crying that comes from grief, but the kind that comes from exposure, pleading with me to understand that they only wanted the best for both of us, that intentions matter more than mistakes. But I held her gaze and said that intentions do not pay tuition, intentions do not refill empty accounts, and intentions do not erase the decades where I was told to be proud of being independent while my sister was carried from one indulgence to another. Mark placed the final document on the table, the one we had held back for this moment, and it was not another letter or sentimental note, but a property record that showed a piece of land my grandparents had owned outright. Land no one in the room had mentioned in years, and the record clearly listed me not just as a beneficiary, but as the controlling executor, which meant that my father had not only concealed financial transfers, but had also deliberately ignored the legal addendum that gave me the authority he had been pretending to hold all this time. The silence that followed was not just shock, it was the collective recognition that the narrative they had been fed for years was collapsing in a single afternoon, and when people realize the script has been manipulated, they do not rally around the manipulator, they rally around the one who proves it. I did not gloat, because gloating would have given them something to attack, and instead I spoke as clearly as I ever have, telling them that I would now be taking direct control of the estate, that the envelopes would be distributed according to the actual instructions left behind, not the story my father invented, that any funds misdirected would be accounted for before distribution, and that if necessary, I would pursue recovery through legal channels, though I would prefer not to drag the family through that if there was even a shred of decency left in my parents' willingness to come clean. I said it not as a threat but as a decision, and for the first time I saw the room treat me not as the forgotten daughter or the quiet one or the stable one who would never make waves, but as the person who now held the keys, the documents, and the authority, which was exactly what my grandparents had intended when they wrote my name in that addendum. Emily stormed out with a half-slam of the door, muttering that none of this was fair, which only confirmed to everyone that fairness was never her concern until it stopped favoring her, while my mother sat with her face buried in her hands, repeating that she never wanted this, that she only wanted harmony, though harmony built on lies was never real, and my father said nothing at all, which told me that for once he had no words strong enough to bend the truth. Mark leaned toward me quietly and said that I had done exactly what needed to be done, that the fight I had been dreading was already won. Not by shouting or dramatics, but by letting the truth stand in the open long enough for people to stop pretending it could be ignored. As people began leaving, with whispers and looks that made it clear sides had shifted permanently, I sat back and let myself feel the exhaustion that comes from years of carrying quiet resentment finally being traded for the steadiness of accountability. And I thought about how many times I had convinced myself that staying silent was easier, that letting my sister have her way was better than being called jealous, and that swallowing the humiliation was safer than being labeled difficult. But in that moment, I realized the only thing silence ever bought me was invisibility, and invisibility is not peace, it is erasure. I knew the family would never look the same, that holidays would carry fractures, and that Emily would spin her story somewhere else, but I also knew that I had finally stepped into the role my grandparents believed I deserved. And the fact that my parents had spent years trying to bury that truth only made it more satisfying to stand in it now. So I ended the gathering with one last sentence, not shouted, not dramatic, just firm, telling them that I would be handling the estate directly, that the days of secrecy were finished, and that if they wanted to be part of the family moving forward, they could start by telling the truth, because the truth had finally found its seat at the table, and no one was going to push it away again. And when I walked out of that room with Mark beside me, I did not feel like I had destroyed a family. I felt like I had finally stopped letting a family destroy me, which is a very different ending than the one my parents had planned. And maybe that is why it felt less like revenge and more like justice that had simply been waiting for the right day to arrive.